I want to welcome you to this Startup Patterns webinar on prioritization. I'm delighted to have you here. So let's dive in, shall we? Okay, there we go. So if you're watching this, it's probably because you've realized that prioritization is one of the hardest things about building products. It's certainly one of the things I get the most questions about in my work. um, and it's kind of plagues everyone, and it's a deceptive problem, right? Like, it seems like it should be really simple, but there are a number of things that are getting in the way. So in this webinar, I'm going to share with you some common anti-patterns, things that you might recognize, and then we'll talk about some of the reasons why prioritization gets snagged in most organizations. And then I will show you some very straightforward work that you can do to make your prioritization much, much, much more solid. All right. And then we'll be able to answer any questions that you have at the end. So if you do have questions, pop them in the chat for now. And when we get to the end, Alyssa will go through them, and I'll answer as many as I can within the time that we have. All right. So here we go. So here's what usually happens. Taking a look at a couple of anti-patterns, see if you recognize any of these in your organization. All right, so I'm going to show you four. You almost certainly have seen them before. Um, the first is our HiPPO. So I don't know, you might have known this acronym before, the highest paid person's opinion. This is probably the most common in organizations that are older and larger. They're more likely to be populated by executives who like to throw their weight around in order to prove that they're still useful. Um, this is the one where everyone is furiously working hard on the quarterly objectives, and the CEO swings by one morning with some urgent new idea and gets everyone to drop what they're doing and start working on the new thing right away. And so sometimes a customer has called with a new issue, or there's like a big new contract that needs to be signed. Sometimes it's just something that they thought of. It doesn't really matter what it is, but no one feels comfortable challenging their position. So the old project is set aside, and there's much grinding of gears and lost momentum as everyone adjusts to the new priority, right? So you've probably seen that before. The second one I like to call split attention. This is the one that happens in organizations often that are in transition from an older business to a newer business. It happens in companies that are trying to serve two vastly different customer segments as well. And usually, because there's split attention and the priorities get muddled as a result, no one is able to do their best on either side of the organization, because the organization itself is having an identity crisis. So teams from both sides are competing for resources. The older product teams claim that it's they who keep the lights on, and so they should be treated with preference, while the newer product teams are saying they're the future and they should be getting equal treatment. The real problem is that leadership hasn't decided on a clear strategy, and so everyone is confused. The third is a little more subtle, and it's one where there are many, many priorities at the same time, and they all bubble up in seemingly random order. I see this one a lot in very large organizations with many stakeholders and many interdependent teams. The teams are typically not dedicated to a single project. They're likely more matrixed. And as a result, they're serving many different internal customers. The pattern is that each of these projects, as they get later, the stakeholders of those projects get louder and louder, and their particular priority shifts to the top. So a few weeks go by, and then the same thing happens with another project. So it's constantly shifting, and it feels like you're trying to hit a moving target, and nobody is happy. And the last one I'll show, and there are many more, but these are sort of my four favorite, is the free for all, which is really happens in organizations that are what you might think of as zombie organizations, where there's either vacant or absent leadership at the top, and very strong organizational silos. So the directors or leaders of each of those silos pick their own priorities, and there's kind of a game of thrones between them for resources. The structure is a bit like the early walled cities of medieval Europe, before power was finally consolidated under the Holy Roman Empire, right? So each duke or duchess has his or her own little army that they wield against all of the other dukes and duchesses. So none of those patterns are great. They all happen a lot in organizations. We see them all the time. Um, and really, what it comes down to is that poor prioritization is an indicator of poor leadership. In all of these cases, that's basically the root cause of each of those anti patterns. And I suspect that many of you are here because you lead a team or a department that is somewhere between the C-suite and the individual contributor. You're in the middle of the hierarchy, um, and where but it's where the real work gets done. So honestly, it's a tough place to be, and you're looking for strategies to get your teams working properly and to protect them from the antics of the senior management, right? So I certainly feel you. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a solid method for organizing your priorities based on real data, based on business value, that you'll be able to start putting into practice right away. It's simple, dead simple, but don't be fooled by its simplicity. It's certainly not easy to do. Speaking of leadership, just a quick word on startup patterns. We've got loads of experience helping tech companies and their leaders in any product organization. Really, we provide one-on-one coaching. We also have some great group coaching programs that you can check out, and we'll also happily come into your company and consult with you on all issues of team structure, leadership, prioritization, lean and agile process, all that good stuff. So reach out if you need help. We'll have some more information at the end for you. So let's talk about why is prioritization so hard. Really, it comes down to this, and we will get into some more sort of data and mathy speaking, but at the end of the day, prioritization requires healthy boundaries and good communication, right? So there's different levels in the org, right? There's sort of the organizational strategic level, there's the teams level where people are building particular products and services, and there's the individual level. And this is a pattern that's analogous across the entire organization. So, what do we mean by healthy boundaries? Well, in psychology, the concept of boundaries, you can have two types of unhealthy boundaries on either end of a continuum. So, you might have very rigid boundaries where you're sort of a prickly person. It's difficult to deal with you because you have a hard time sort of trusting anyone. Folks like that are difficult to work with. You might also have boundaries that are too fluid and too open, right? So in an individual, when the boundaries are either too rigid or too fluid, it creates a lot of chaos. And so a healthy person, they say, typically has flexible boundaries that can be not too rigid and not too fluid, but will sort of adjust with the particular situation. And good communication, what do we mean by good communication? It's communication that is direct and honest and compassionate, right? And so when people in organizations are able to maintain healthy boundaries and maintain good communication, we can have more intelligent, grown up discussions about priorities and be able to work together as a team to establish what is actually important in the organization, right? So before you get into the data and the spreadsheets and all that stuff, it's actually really important to set some precedent around communication and boundaries in the org. Of course, that starts at the top. And if you're not at the top, there may be a bit more of a challenge in you getting this through at your area of the organization. But I can certainly help you think through how to manage up and start to create conditions of better boundaries and better communication as well. So I want to point to a couple of ways in which this flows into prioritization. First of all, the organization may be missing a clear vision and a clear strategy. Um, Everybody thinks they have a strategy. I can't even count the number of organizations that I've encountered that have something that they call a strategy that is not, in fact, a strategy, right? So, a vision and a strategy is critical before you can even make any priorities, right? Like you need to know where you're going and how you plan to get there. The vision helps to avoid unnecessary distractions. It's a picture of the world in the future, the way that you want it to be. And a strategy is really a map of the territory, and you pick a particular route of how you're going to get there. And when you have a strategy, the way you can tell is there's a lot of other possible avenues that have been cut off. Like we're not going to tackle this market segment. We're going to focus on this other market segment. So it's really a lot about deciding what you're not going to do. And believe it or not, that's sort of the key to prioritization is figuring out what to say no to in order to say yes to just the right things. You can't really set good goals without vision and strategy. And without good goals, you can't prioritize. Um, it's also really important then, once you've established that, to have focus. A lot of organizations I work with have fallen into one of these traps, the one big client trap, right? So if you are a B2B organization and you have a bunch of big customers, it's often the case that the biggest customer gets preferential treatment. You end up doing a lot of customization that takes you off the product roadmap for them because they're waving, lots of money in your face. And so the organization can get dragged along in that direction. I've written a whole article about the one big customer trap, which gets into this in a lot of detail. There can also be misalignment. So alignment across the org is really a good sign of focus. Is everyone following the same objectives? Are we all kind of rowing in the same direction? And of course, we talked about this a little bit with the HiPPO in the first part, with that magpie syndrome. A magpie is that bird that likes to go pick up any shiny thing that they see. And so there are lots of orgs, particularly less mature organizations, where they haven't settled into a rhythm and they're going around and picking up everything shiny to chase after it, right? So those are problems of focus. And without focus, it's really hard to prioritize. There's also the matter of trust. So trust in an organization is something that is hard to operate on directly. Um, Culture is more of an emergent uh, phenomena that comes out of people's implicit behaviors, right? But culture is super, super important. And you want to have a culture of trust and openness and transparency if you are to be able to prioritize properly at all, right? So Peter Drucker famously said, culture eats process for breakfast, right? So us technical and product people, we like to get into process and figure out our workflows and have all our spreadsheets, and we feel protected by that process as a contractual agreement between humans. But you've no doubt noticed that people will act in strange ways when they need to, because the culture actually sets what are the okay things to talk about, what are the sort of protocols for communication, how do people treat each other. And so without trust, you can't really have good prioritization. And delegation also requires trust. Speaking of delegation, let's just touch on one more piece of the puzzle, which is micromanagement, right? So I talked about prioritization. When it's not in good shape, it's a sign of poor leadership. And one of the biggest flags that I see around poor leadership is micromanagement, right? And this wreaks havoc with prioritization. Good managers, good leaders are able to delegate and create succession plans for the people that report to them. It's really one of the foundational keys, right? And so micromanagement happens when a manager or a leader is not able to delegate effectively for a variety of reasons. We want instead to encourage more autonomy and mastery and purpose, taking a page out of Dan Pink's book, Drive, on our teams. Autonomy and mastery and purpose is really important for teams to be effective. And so if we have that and we can avoid micromanagement, the prioritization process becomes a lot easier, right? And so we want to encourage a culture of trust, but we also want to verify with data, right? So there are many frameworks out there for prioritization. I gathered a very small list. There are dozens and dozens more. You may have heard of some of these. You may have seen the Kano model, sort of for customer happiness. There's Moscow, which is sort of must do, should do, could do, and won't do. It's kind of a neat way of thinking about it. There's Rice, which is reach times impact times confidence over effort, and various 2 by 2 matrices, right? There's nothing wrong inherently with any of these frameworks for thinking about prioritization, but the way that I see them used is really the problem. It's not the framework, it's the data you use in the framework, right? So all of those frameworks are fine, and they can all basically be boiled down to the same essential formula. The problem is that when people use them, they're basically guessing, right? So in any 2 by 2 matrix, usually it's something you put on the wall. So there might be, importance sort of vertically and maybe effort right to left. And you've got all these things on sticky notes and you want to put them on the matrix. The thing is, picking a spot on the matrix is a gut check, right? It's not actually informed by data. And humans tend to be very, very poor at judging probabilities and judging actual numeric values, right? And so it's a good way in a pinch to sort of organize your thoughts and get everything up on the wall so that we at least can see what everyone else in the team thinks is important, but it's not going to really help you prioritize by value. So I use a really simple formula, and this is basically at the heart of all of these other frameworks that we've looked at. Um, and it's very simple. They're all based on the value that a particular item will bring to the business, minus the cost of doing that, right? But don't be fooled by how simple this formula is. These two values have a lot of complexity behind them, and that's actually what's hard about prioritization, is going to get the data that you need in order to calculate this, right? So if you had a list of initiatives, epics, experiments you wanted to run, different product features, whatever they are, and you put everything in a spreadsheet with a column for the value and a column for the cost, and you did a simple calculation and sorted it, then you would have your priority. The problem is you don't have that data. You don't actually know the data that you need to calculate value. And you almost certainly don't have a sense of your costs. It's possible that you do. Rare is the organization that has this figured out. It's not so much the formula, it's the numbers and how to get them. And the reason is that they're all actually probabilistic calculations that have to be collected through a discovery process, right? Like you don't just pull it out of Jira or ask the CEO, because if you could, you wouldn't have this problem and you wouldn't be in this webinar, right? So, what do we mean by value exactly, right? Like, so each thing that you're trying to prioritize is going to have some value for the business, right? Like, when we build this feature or this product or this platform, we expect that it will have a particular business outcome for us. How do we go about calculating what that value might be? And remember, it's probabilistic, right? So the first thing we need to do is talk to customers. Talking to customers is the most important thing in product development. None of the companies and organizations I've talked to over the last 15 to 20 years does enough of it. Um, and it's something that you really just need to build into your culture, of having a process of constantly talking to customers and making sure that you're rolling their needs into your product development process on a regular basis, right? Further, you can't sell to everyone. You have to narrow your focus to as narrow a niche as possible. Even if you're a big company, it's important that products be aligned with specific customer segments that are um, identifiable in the market, and that the product or service really nails that pain point that those customers have, right? And so, too many teams and too many companies are trying to make a one size fits all product or service and try to sell it to everyone. And they wonder why they can't prioritize on a feature set, right? Also, it's important to have really clear metrics in terms of what you're trying to do in the product in order to calculate value, right? So I said that value is probabilistic. It means that you have an assumption that if you were to add such and such a feature, customers would use it in a certain way, and that would have some impact on the bottom line, right? And so you got to understand how to measure the flow of value through your product. Let me show you a couple of ways to look at that. Here's some visualization. I actually learned this from my buddy David Bland. When we worked at Neo together, we were obsessed with trying to figure out how to best visualize funnel metrics. So this is that classic pirate metrics formula of a funnel, the stages that a customer goes through. Um, as I recall, David drawing it on the whiteboard many years ago. But we found this to be a really effective way to think about product metrics, right? So anything on your prioritization list, if you're building a product or building anything associated with a business, you're going to try to encourage behavior of customers to go through one of these stages, right? We're either trying to encourage more acquisition, maybe we're trying to improve our retention, right? And each of those areas, you can hypothesize that it will have some kind of impact on the bottom line, on the actual unit economics of your system, right? So you can roughly organize these into stages. If you're at a relatively early stage, you're probably still focused on empathy. Do we actually have a problem worth solving? In which case, most of your efforts would be focused on acquisition. You can't really do much with the other two stages if you're still in the uh, empathy stage. Do we have a problem worth solving? Once you've got a problem that you've verified people want to buy products or buy services for, then you're trying to make the best possible experience for them as you can. And that's when you're in the stickiness phase, and you would be more likely to be focusing on activation and retention metrics, and probably the revenue balance as well. Like, what's your pricing model and that sort of thing, right? And then later, when you're growing and scaling, you're really focused more on how to make the product so amazing that you encourage customers to refer each other to your product and that sort of thing, right? But the reason this is important is because where you put your attention depends on what stage that you're in, right? And so anything in your prioritization list is going to basically be a hypothesis that if we were to add such and such a feature, it would improve retention by this much, right? And so that would mean that if we're right, we will be able to add to the bottom line if we pull that off, right? But you can look at all of the work that you've done before and see that value uh, equals the impact times the likelihood, right? So if we work on that feature, what is the chance that we will actually improve that metric at all? And you can look at the historical work that you've done and how much knowledge you have about the customer to see whether or not you're likely to be right. And this roughly equates to the confidence score from the Rice model or any other prioritization model that has a confidence score. It's basically a probability. But remember that the key here is actually not in the numbers, it's in your ability to gauge probability, right? So, like I said, most humans are terrible at figuring out probabilities. There's a way of doing it popularized by Douglas Hubbard. If you haven't looked at Hubbard, who wrote How to Measure Anything, you should check out Hubbard's work. He talks about methods of calibration, where you can actually learn how to get better at gauging probabilities through an ongoing feedback loop. So teams can get better over time, but it's important to go and get this data and measure it and look at it and try to think about your value score as probabilistically as you possibly can, right? Okay, so we've got it down that priority equals a value score, which is a probability or a probabilistic value that takes a lot of discovery to kind of figure out what it is, minus cost. Well, then the question is, well, what do we mean by cost, right? And here we go again. It turns out that cost is also probabilistic, right? So the cost of doing anything on the priority scale um, has to do with how your team's performance actually is now and when they're likely to get something done, right? And so most teams that I've seen do not do this sort of thing. So here we have a very simple chart. This is just pulled straight out of the Jira system, some team from a long time ago. Can't even remember who it is. This was their chart. And so this is real data, right? This is a real team that was closing tickets and getting things done. Um, and what you're looking at is called a control chart. This dates way back to W. Edwards Deming and statistical quality control used by Toyota and other sort of lean manufacturers. The general idea is that the timeline is flowing from left to right, and the vertical axis is the amount of time it took to complete any given item, right? And so all those green dots and blobs are a scatter plot of when those items were completed. And so by measuring this is what we call cycle time, you can start to get a sense of when the team typically finishes a unit of work, right? And so there's two parts to this cost puzzle, right? Like you need to have enough discovery that you can identify what would be involved in building this thing and have the team um, do some level of estimation. And you can use planning poker, you can use uh, any group based planning method with the people who are actually going to do the work are involved in breaking it down and trying to estimate. But again, with these levels of team estimation, you also have the same challenge of calibration. So a team will get better over time as they gel as a team in terms of learning how far off their last estimates were, and slowly over time they will adjust. So you're both measuring their actual throughput and cycle time as a team to get some baseline metrics, and then you're also honing and improving their estimate ability against those metrics, right? And so when you have a feature that's being proposed, you can use these probabilistic ways of guessing what the value is going to be and what the cost is going to be with relative and improving accuracy, right? So priority basically equals a value, which is a probability that you'll have to go get, and a cost, which is also a probability that you'll have to go get. So the key, as I said, is not so much in the complexity or magnificence of the formula. It's in actually having a process that really allows you to calculate probability. You cannot prioritize anything before a discovery process for that thing has occurred. You can't just look at a list of items on a spreadsheet somewhere and try to come up with some prioritization. You have to actually do the work of measuring the team performance and over time keeping that team relatively stable, working away and using their cycle time and throughput metrics to figure out typical costs for typical amounts of things. And that can go probabilistically into your chart. And then the value is based on talking to customers and understanding your business model. Those are the real reasons why teams can't prioritize very well. It's because they don't have a culture and a system in place that allows them to do those things in a really methodical manner. All right, so that's all we've got for the probability and prioritization section. I want to thank you for your time. We're going to be taking some questions in a minute. And while I am looking for the questions, I want to just mention that everyone who's here, or even if you watch a recording of this later, I can help you work through these issues in detail. All you have to do is book some time with me. My Calendly link is right there on the screen. There's an hour consultation that's available to everyone. You can book an hour right now, get some time on my calendar, bring me your specific issues with your team, and I will help you work through better ways of prioritizing your stuff.